from their encounters with races from other planets. The information is the activation. Let's awaken this world together. We are the forever students, and we will not be silent. We are the ones that we've been waiting for pretty well. Welcome, everybody to Full Spectrum Universe. My name is Rob Yox. This is the Embattled broadcast from behind enemy lines, and happy day, everyone. It is Saturday. We are hanging out. It's Saturday night. We're going to have a great time tonight, and, you know, we have a lot of information to go into tonight, so I'm going to probably jump right into it. And first and foremost, I wanted to sincerely thank Martine for the generous donation that we have at the PayPal link above at the top of the chat. It is one of the ways you can help to donate this to this operation and help us to reach more people, collaborate, and do bigger and better things. So if you're interested, please, with love, donate to the link in the PayPal up top. But thank you, Martine, for the tremendously generous donation. We appreciate you. We love you. And we can't sustain ourselves without that kind of stuff. So thank you so much for keeping the operation going and funding us. What an incredible time to be alive. We see veils lifting. We see things happening all around us. And it is truly remarkable how we are all coming into this grand enlightening phase where we see what's happening. And at first, it kind of takes us back a little bit. And we're not understanding why. So one of the things we're going to be talking about tonight is the agenda of the Cabal, as well as the histories of Greece, Rome, the Muhammad Accords, and the intergalactic repercussions or ripples that happened from the Great Flood. And we're going to jump into it right away with part 13. I was almost actually thinking about not naming this part 13. And just because 13 is not really a lucky number, but if you don't believe in those things, it's not really going to hamper on you. And one of the things I want to say before we even start is I am not giving any of my energy to the information that we're talking about this evening. I am completely restricting my energy flow from being engaged in it, but we must talk about it. It's imperative that we're in the knowing and not of the not knowing or of the not wanting to know, because there's so much of this still going on right now as we see, because this is actually the current history of humanity. This is what archaeologists talk about, historians. This is their roadmap, right? There's just a backdrop that's not normally talked about, and that's what we're going to kind of focus on tonight. And I think it's absolutely imperative that we take it as it is and kind of not really use this information to contradict their thoughts, but kind of use this information to facilitate that there's more going on than they would like to let us believe, right? So with that being said, also, Watchers Talk is going to be on at 8 o'clock Eastern Standard Time right after us. I believe that's 5 o'clock Pacific Standard Time. If you live in between, you can do the math. But let's jump in. Let's jump right into this. This is called the Great Rebuilding Phase, right? And we know that this is going to take place between 10,000 BC and 0 AD, which is a huge, huge swath of time, right? So from this point on, we already have one history that's been accepted, right? This is what I was just talking about. The one we all learn about is the cavemen, primitive tribes, the early civilizations of Egypt, Greece, the Orient, etc., etc. What's missing is the massive backdrop of all that went before, and the fact that there were other higher density realities and beings with agendas, both positive and negative, in the picture. And they were hanging out behind the scenes trying to usher mankind into specific areas, right? So there are different densities that we talk about. We go from third density, fourth density, fifth density, sixth density, seventh density, eighth density. Eighth density is usually the limit when we're talking about Earth within this paradigm or within this time of Earth's history. While I'm sure that there are 10th dimensional beings, 11th dimensional beings, all the way up to 12, they're not known to the parties that we're going to be talking about tonight. So let's keep moving forward here, right? So basically, we start with the Knuckles. The Knuckles and the various high ranking members of the Maya, which is the priesthood, right? Along with the positive polarity Anunnaki and other genetic farmer races, did their best to shepherd and guide the people back towards a more evolved consciousness, sometimes overtly, and sometimes by discreetly nudging events and people for the here and there, right? This is what they wanted. They wanted us to get back to where we were before the Great Flood. You have to remember that everything was destroyed. Life was turned on its head, and only small pockets of civilization. We went from probably about 31 million people on the planet to about 3,000. And that was immediately afterwards. So they're facilitating their ability to bring humanity back from the brink of destruction, right? So the first thing they wanted to do is reseed the planet of plant and animal life from the DNA that they had gathered before the cataclysm, and to continue to develop the consciousness grid they had anchored with a network of pyramids across the globe. Remember, we talked about the sixth density pyramid being dropped into third density and becoming stone, right? Remember, we said that last episode. So as these years passed, they would guide their followers across the world, and it would help them construct more pyramids and massive megalithic structures to strengthen the consciousness grid across the planet. Think of Stonehenge, right? And all the other standing stone sites across the world, as well as the pyramids that have been found on all continents, some very recently, and many of those were constructed during this span of time, right? So some of the later pyramids were built as of stone, and it was pretty crazy, right? So, on another note that I wanted to bring to the table here was, on their construction, these later structures were actually built with stone, not like the initial manifesting of the pyramids of Giza, right? Not manifested down from the higher density like the Great Pyramid of Giza, but they were not built by hand, but rather through the use of anti gravity technology. Some of this tech was in the form of an actual device handed down through the generations from the Atlantean time, but more often, the higher ranking priests in the culture who had been inundated in various teachings of their gods used consciousness and sound to move and place the stones, which is what we see, right? It looks like the slide got a little cut off, but no worries. It's all good. So, also, the reason that most of the pyramids that were built during this time, if you notice, most of them have a flat top, right? And this is true across the entire world: South America, China, the South Pacific Sea, the smaller islands. It's because the apex of the pyramid was actually a fourth density mini pyramid that sat on top of the flat stone. It was a higher density pyramid that was powered by the stone structure and interfaced with the consciousness grid. So we see that happening, right? We see that they're using these flat topped grids, these flat top pyramids actually have another structure that sits on top of that flat top. It's all, if we look at the pyramid of Giza, we see that there is a cap, but they still believe that there was a cap stone that's still yet to be found. So we see this happening everywhere. These pyramids are meant to essentially interface with the consciousness grid of the planet, which is what you see on the left-hand side here. That's the grid. And what that grid does is it creates that community consciousness, or that universal consciousness that can be established with the entire universe when connected properly. So, something to think about, right? I think it's pretty wild. But so most of the Knuckles, we talked about the Knuckles before, settled in India and Tibet, and they would teach Jesus resurrection, like we talked about earlier as well, where many of the higher consciousness folks from Lemuria had ended up. And if you examine the ancient Vedic scripts and artworks, you will see numerous references and depictions of advanced flying craft and weaponry, as well as undeniable alien figures. Krishna was blue, remember. He didn't look like the regular people, even though he was patroned as a god, right? These were the vessels and persons of the Knuckle group and other ET races. That's where the Knuckles ended up staying above ground and doing some of the greatest work that we have yet to be seen. If you've read the Vimana or some of the Vedic texts and scriptures, you know that they are absolutely embedded with spirituality and a higher level of consciousness, right? Let's keep going. Oh, guys, I forgot to tell you too. Please, please share this out. This is probably one of the most intense but important shows that we've done to date. This specific chapter is one of the most important, and we're going to get into why. Because we're going to talk about the absolute adversary that we face right now, right? Right now. So, we see now that most of the Maya ended up as well the Mayans, right? They did end up as Native American type tribes in South America, and they began to intermixing with the folks who were mostly made up from survivors of the general populace of Mu. So these are some of the Atlanteans and the Mus. Remember, the Maya were the priesthood of Atlantis. By the time 2500 BC rolled around, they had a well established civilization, the only civilization in South America to have a comprehensive writing system and precise and advanced architectural featuring. Surprise, again, pyramids, right? Those were the feature. So we see that essentially the Mayas became the Mayans. And we're going to talk about their distant cousins and how we can use certain little things that we know about each culture to kind of collaborate who these people are, right? So the reason that the Mayan culture vanished or mysteriously disappeared at around 1000 AD is because they were needed back on their home planet, right? The Knuckles came from a distant planet. They came from the underdeveloped Lyra sector, right? The more spiritual and consciousness based Lyrans. But the Lyrans now are highly advanced and sort of intermingle the consciousness and the technology, but in a good way, right? Not in an adversarial way. So another branch from the Atlantean Mystery School came to Britain and established the Order of the Druids there, as well as a fourth density community that would later be called Avalon. And we hear about within the context of King Arthur and Merlin. They talk about Avalon, this place of sheer just opulence, and it wasn't opulence in the way of gold and jewels, which it was, but it was more about the spiritual opulence of it, right? We see that happening, and now people are starting to spread out. And again, this is an archetype planet. So all of these different peoples that were left had the genetic coding of 22 different extraterrestrial races, which now with the expansion and the moving of things are they're basically setting a precedent that no matter what happens, this will never happen again where humanity can be completely wiped out and the living library or archive will be wiped out with it, right? So we keep going. We keep going. And we also have to remember that there were 22 genetic farmer races at the time, and most of them took in their respective genetic programs under their wing, some literally, right? So some of these farmer races started to drastically change the peoples that they had migrated with to these certain areas. And there's a reason that the ancient Chinese and Japanese cultures featured dragons as benevolent gods. For the farmer races, those lineages were various branches of the dragon queen Tiamat's people, who were benevolent reptilian race that basically sided with the Anunnaki and eventually would side with the Knuckles as well and raise their vibration, right? So they weren't third density reptilian brain mindset. Though the Japanese history also features evil dragons and these were from a different race of sea dwelling reptilians that were not so nice, right? So there's polarity within the reptilian community, and we know that now. There's only a few good ones, but there's a lot of bad ones, and that's because this planet is made up 70% of water, and we see that that's where they would dwell. So the land dwelling draconians were not as evil in most points in history. Now, sometimes they interchange, the good will change to bad, and we see lineages happen, right? So there's another race we want to talk about, and that's the earthly Nordic races that were out. They were basically helped out by their progenitors or their predecessors, the Nordic ET group and the Asgardian people, who have been prominently featured, of course, in Marvel films, which is where this what you see here comes from. That's Thor. He is a Marvel. He's Marvel's God of Thunder, right? But he's also part of the Asgardian pantheon. So, incidentally, the Marvel films are all a part of a partial disclosure agenda. And we know this is where we talk about life imitating art or art imitating life. And, I'll get into the difference between this sort of part disclosure and full disclosure a little bit later, and there's a lot of factual elements that are presented as fantasy, right? Asgard, ice giants, enormous floating battle carriers with cloaking technology, intergalactic multi-density civilizations with many, many types of beings, both good and evil, an evil group secretly working in the Earth's intelligence community to bring about world domination, aka, if you watch Captain America, Hydra, right, equals the Cabal, all based on fact. And we see that repetitiously happening over and over and over. And these movies are indications of partial disclosures of agendas. It's a way that they get you to sign on, right? And I'm sure that Omar will go further into that signing on process, right? So now we get to a specific peoples called the Hebrew peoples. Remember, they came from off planet and were dispersed amongst Atlantis. But the Hebrew people have a story of 10 lost tribes that vanished in the time after the flood. This is because they were split up during the devastation of Atlantis, right? The lost tribes were a contingent of the Hebrew people who had been in Mu for quite some time, developing their consciousness and living a life of more immersed in nature than tech or within the physical. They were becoming symbiotic with the land and living off of the land and using the Gaia Earth grids to essentially enhance their consciousness, right? I think that that's absolutely amazing because that's what we strive for today. We strive to be one with everything around us, right? So when the cataclysm struck, those who were on Atlantis ending up going east and establishing what would become Israel, and the ones of Mu were driven west and north to what would become America and Canada. The Aboriginal tribes of North America and some of the groups in the Caribbean are actually descendants of these lost tribes. And we see that there is a similarity between the Hebrews and the Native Americans. And we're going to go into what they are, right? So there are many tribes of Native Americans, but in general, consider the similarities between that race and the Hebrews. Similar facial features and similar coloring in the skin, hair, and eyes. Both groups call the creator Yahweh or some variation of that, like Yah, or Yahiwah, right? Sounds very similar. If we do hermeneutics, we can see the breakdown of that. Both groups tended to be more towards the nomadic lifestyle. Both groups carried some sort of an ark into battle. Both groups celebrate the 7 feasts and kept the seventh day of rest and had cities of refuge, and they both don't eat pork. So we see that there are similarities amongst their belief, right? Even the wording of many of their prayers from both cultures sound the same or similar. And that's, I'm not saying that this is 100% factual that they are that similar, but they truly are. If you look at some of what they talk about, you can find in comparative mythology some of the aspects of their cultures that line up with each other. And to me, that is one of the most fascinating things. And it's also a tell. It's also a tell that they literally find a common ancestry down the line. And we know there are common ancestries all over the planet. So we want to make sure that we recognize those because they're important. They're important to know that we are all one people, regardless of where you think you came from or where you think you don't come from. We're all carrying the same sort of genetics and we all have the same ancestors, which is vitally important to know, right? We have to know these things. It's how we move forward. So, as we get back on to the next slide, and we have the positive polarity Anunnaki, who were still on Earth at this point, helped out the people who flocked by to Mesopotamia, or basically moved to Mesopotamia and cultivated and developed what would become the Egyptian culture, right? Now, I'm going to list off a few things that essentially we see happening in these cultures. It's pretty well observed and in consensual versions of history for modern historians that have been baffled by this so-called stair step evolution of Egypt. You know, there was only an oral tradition, then suddenly there was a complete system of writing all at once used by everyone. Then, water and moat systems are implemented, right? Then advanced hydraulic systems are suddenly put into place across the land. Each of these developments are referred to in Egypt lore or Egyptian lore as gifts from the gods, which they were, though one must substitute that if you replace God with ET, it would be accurate. It would be accurate. All of these tech or sort of philosophies of life are handed in such a fast way to the Egyptian people that it becomes almost asinine to think that they didn't have help from somewhere else, right? And we see that everywhere. So as we keep going, during this time of cultural development, there was still division in the ranks among the Anunnaki, right? Like Anki, many had cultivated their consciousness and embraced a service to others vibration, and the others had who most definitely did not embrace this service to others. They were still stuck in the negative service to self, and most of the negative polarity Anunnaki were back on Nibiru at this time. But there were a few powerful exceptions, and this has created debate and conflict, mostly about the best way to cultivate human civilization, mainly revolving around what degree of interference should be allowed, and if it was still okay to use humans as a labor force to advance their own agendas in gold mining or whatever else the case, right? So there's two characters of mythos who we talk about that have this dispute in multiple battles, right? So the two of them who would butt heads, and that was Marduk, who was now called Ra, and we'll see this happening here, right? And there was also Ningizadad, who was called Thoth, and we know that there's the tablets of Thoth, and also there is a lot of history in that as well. So eventually, Enki, who kept behind the scenes during this time, was unknown to the Egyptians and stepped in and settled this dispute and reluctantly gave this territory to his own son Marduk, who again his name is Ra, hoping that the hard lessons of leadership might change his mindset and help him develop compassion and empathy. But Ra rewrote the histories to make himself the supreme god. So now all of these other gods take a back seat because, of course, he's in service to self, right? Thoth continued to be venerated or loved and appreciated by the people, right? Thoth then went went on to help out with Stonehenge around 28 BC. After that, he traveled to the developing Mayan civilization, where he became known as Quetzalcoatl, right? So we know that that is Thoth. And there are similarities in their understanding of who they are as people. We can see that these two different characters line up very, very similarly, right? Let's keep going. So now we have another group that is involved itself heavily in the Egyptian culture, where that was the 13 royal bloodlines from Orion. The race had massive elongated skulls, which you can see in many of the depictions of pharaohs from the ancient Egyptian dynasties, right? We see that. They all possess elongated skulls. You see the gentleman in white at the left end of the picture. Those are royalty elongated skulls, right? And, other entities that we could talk about during the time of Egypt are not as heavily into the galactical background, right? We can go into Egypt and talk about the different deities and what their purposes were and who they were, but the top dogs are the ones that are basically instilling life, right? They're the ones instilling a way of life. So we have to, when we go through this area of history, we have to touch on those specific entities and not really go any further, because the next part becomes, this is where things get very, very dark. And I'm prefacing that as sort of a trigger warning, but also because I'm not lending any evidence or any of my energy to this information, but it has to be known. And thank you, David, for pointing that out. That I need to make sure that I separate myself and my energy from some of this information, because while it is dark and it must be brought to light, I am not agreeing in any of the actions, or am I here to be anything but opposed to what these 13 royal bloodlines do going further from this point, right? So I've said it. Let's keep going. So later on, the Anunnaki would cultivate another emerging civilization in the same area, and that's the Greeks, right? With the Greeks, they abandoned the disguises they had used with the Egyptians, in the sense of, they gave themselves a little bit lighter skin to fit in with the Greek culture, and they also lost a lot of their headdresses that were, you see, Ra had the head of an eagle or the head of a falcon. They no longer use those disguises to implement who they were, and we see that, right? So basically, the consciousness in Greece at this time, around 700 BC, was more highly advanced. So this is more of the good Anunnaki, the higher evolving consciousness Anunnaki, right? And they could accept that the gods could appear like them but still be divine. Some members of the Anunnaki once again indulged with having sex with mortal women, which would recount in Greek history as some of the demigods, right? We hear about Hercules, Achilles, those type of feature, those type of mythos, right? By the time the Greek culture was well established, the consciousness grid across Earth, let me switch that slide, thank you. The consciousness grid across Earth, which had been built by the Knuckles and cultivated by other former races and their peoples, began to reach its full potential. It was basically like a crutch to bolster human consciousness, so that it could grow again as it did before. And the grid got stronger and stronger, and so did human consciousness, right? So the Greek culture represented a real upswing in that consciousness. For while they did still act on desires of conquest, such as Alexander the Great, they also investigated and greatly furthered science, philosophy, ethics, and mastered many, many forms of art. So we see that their culture is arising, right? We know that there's a ton of different people, such as Plato, Socrates, where they were really contemplating existence and contemplating what had come before. And that to me is essentially looking back into consciousness to evolve and to greatly raise their frequency, which I think is incredible, right? So we see that the Greeks were doing amazing things, and this upswing in consciousness, right? It turned it turned around and bolstered the grid, and the consciousness field of Earth began to become more organic and less reliant on the built grid of the pyramids and things like that, right? Or devices to maintain it. It was becoming more natural, and this was a real threat to the Cabal, and was that was the conquest of Egypt by the Greeks, a move which the Greek gods had encouraged because the depth to which the Orion group had infiltrated the Egyptian society. And if you look at the images of the Ptolemaic dynasties, you'll notice no more elongated skulls. So the Greeks invaded Egypt to essentially, it was basically the gods telling the Greeks to go and destroy their adversaries. So the people that they saw were doing wrong. So they played man as a pawn in both aspects, right? So while they were still good, there was polarity within their actions. So the elite group, the elite Orion group, had been hanging out mostly in Antarctica, quietly continuing their pursuits of advancements in science, particularly in genetic manipulation and electromagnetic gravitic weapons, scalar technology, right? Scalar weapons. But they had long ago also interbred with humans and established tendrils of their bloodlines throughout many cultures, most prominently in the Egyptian culture, as previously mentioned, right? And they were also connected to their Draco allies under the ground and throughout the world. And they kept their finger on the pulse of what was happening. And Greek understanding continued to push consciousness grid towards a positive fourth density state. They decided to take action. This is where we see a lot of really, really, really bad things going on. And we see a downfall in society. So, as we keep going, they had already infiltrated other cultures that were emerging in the area. One of which was Rome, right? We know the conventional. Let me bring it back to me real quick. We know the conventional story of Greece to Rome. So two brothers in Greece decided that they wanted their own. They didn't want to live under the Greek democracy anymore. They decided they were going to make their own village or their own place to live, and they migrated west. They migrated west and they migrated west until they got to Italy, right? And then they found the mountains, went over the mountains, and created their civilization, thinking that the mountains would close them off from peoples. But when people found out that Rome was becoming very well established, they traveled to see Rome because Rome was said to have just complete freedom from everywhere else. But there was an ulterior motive, right? We're going to get to that now. So this is why the Romans were the most powerful, brutal, bloody, war minded culture to emerge from this period. For the Cabal had infiltrated the culture at all levels, their society at all levels. And it's what they did best. They nudged it towards service to self, and they nudged it towards the service to self mentality and the conquest of others. There were many good elements in Rome as as a culture, but their people were everywhere in this area now. But the beginnings of Rome was meant to be good. Then it got infiltrated, and the decline of Rome is where things get really chaotic, right? So the fall of Rome and the devastation it wreaked along the way can be tracked by the infiltration by the Cabal and its appetites. The Romans won a decisive victory over the Greeks in the Battle of Corinth in 146 BC, and then went later to conquer the Ptolemaic dynasty in Egypt in 30 BC. And as part of this decimation of Greek culture, The Romans adopted the Greek pantheons of gods, but they changed their names. Zeus became Jupiter, Poseidon became Neptune, and they really inherited these gods in name only for the positive Anunnaki, heartbroken by the decimation of the culture that they had been cultivating, which had shown such promise, basically said, you know what, screw it at this point. And most of them returned to Nibiru. So when they transferred these gods over, they weren't as, they were actually off planet by this time. So they were entities in that they were paying homage to that were no longer on this planet, right? So now the next part is, while conquering Egypt, the Roman leaders also came into contact with the ancient dark religious practices that the Orion group had established there, which had continued underground during the Potomac dynasty. Practices involving the torture and sacrifice of humans, including children. Many Roman leaders were initiated into these groups, and this laid the foundation for the satanic religion that we see practiced all over the earth by the Cabal and its associates to this day, right? In fact, one of the biggest centers of satanic worship has been, ironically, I mean, it's Italy. It's a big, tall building in Italy. We all know it's got a gate around it, the Vatican, right? And some of the aspects of the Roman Catholic Church, they feel that it has been indoctrinated. And, you know, I didn't believe this for a long time. And I'm going to tell you why. I thought that, I was raised Roman Catholic. So I believed that my faith was privy to be through my church. And my church was the reason that I had that faith. I was way off, right? I don't do business with God. I believe in God, and nobody else has to believe in God, but I believe in the Roman Catholic God or creator. And this is just my opinion now. This is not me influxing my opinion into the work, right? This is me kind of taking a step back for a second. And I realized that whatever you call your higher power, whether it's God, the universe, source, I didn't have to go to a place of worship to do business with that entity. I could do that right here, and I could be a vessel for good. So even if I am wrong and believing in God in the sense of Him actually being there, I'm taking what is positive of practice and giving it back to the people and being of service to others as opposed to service to self. And this is why I think it's important to examine at least these beliefs, not to fully go behind it, but take from it what you need further your ascension or further your raise in vibration. And I do that as well in my own accords as much as everybody else does. So I think it's important to discuss that. But let's get back to the story because it's not about me, right? It's about the information, information above everything. So the consciousness grid had its work cut out for it against this influence of the Cabal, truly, because it's taking a beating now with all this negative going on. So despite great teachers who came down from the sixth density to help, like Buddha, Jesus, these type of entities were helpers of consciousness grid. They tried to raise it, not denounce it, right? The Cabal was generally successful at eventually perverting the teachings of these great figures and twisting them into religions that served the Cabal's end. And although this was less so with Buddhism, for when, Siddhartha was teaching, the Cabal was still mostly behind the scenes. But by the time of the crucifixion of Christ at the hands of the Cabal, the earth was in a very, very, very dark place. So this is where, again, we're going to make a small trigger warning because I want to make sure that this information isn't given power, but we must discuss it. And I said that many times throughout this broadcast because I believe that it's important to see it, but don't engage in it on an energetic level, right? pull back from it. So, from the height of the Roman Empire to present day, the Cabal has uncontested control of the power structures on this planet, although mostly from behind the scenes. So I think it would be good to stop for a moment and ask a couple of questions, right? Like, why? Why? Why does the Cabal have the need to dominate, oppress, and enslave the people of Earth? What's their motivation? Well, the obvious answer is so that they can ensure their own power and comfort. But there's a deeper motivation underneath that, and that's the Losh, right? Most people know what the Losh is. So if you don't, I'm going to skim over it briefly, but I'm not going to get into detail how they harvest the Losh because it's not nice. If you want to look that up on your own time, you can do that. But this is the psychic, emotional, chemical energy that is emitted by beings who are suffering or tormented. It gives those who tap into an intense or into this intense sort of chemical energy. It gives them a high, and it's extremely addictive. This is why members of both human and non-human have such a penchant for really bad things, right? And we know that they go after younglings because younglings tend to be more bolstered in that energy, is a nice way to put it, right? And we know that there's thousands of kidnappings worldwide, and it's really not good at all. But, one of the biggest arguments I hear from people who don't believe in the Cabal is how could a handful of elites possibly control and manipulate all the news anchors, Hollywood celebrities, politicians, so on and so on. The answer is blackmail, and the adreno that we talked about. That's how they do it. So once you take it, you're basically doomed, right? Because if you stop taking it, then it'll kill you. And this is how they get people on board. So the elites seduce influential people or people with the potential to be influential step by step into this web. First with the power and money, and then with the forbidden pleasures that they talk about later on, right? But there are more commonplace examples of the L, which is the Loosh, we're going to call it the L, that we see every day with the war on, the terror of wars, the desires to slow down and look at car wrecks, the addictive pleasures of things you see online, and the thrill of a horror flick, even the constant nagging or worrying over unpaid bills and deadlines. They're always commonplace, and they seduce you to that dark side of that dark energy, right? So the Cabal is now made up of humans like you and me, and also by different kinds of Dracos. But it started by the extraterrestrial group from Orion, and many of these beings are still present in the third, fourth, and fifth densities, and are connected physically to the higher ranking members of this Cabal, right? The higher density consciousness reptilians like the Chikar or the White Draco are also the overlords of this group. For these higher density creatures, the Loosh is extremely potent food and drug all in one, just like the dark version of mana or divine nectar. We see this a lot. So this is one of the basic fundamental driving forces behind all of the control and oppression that we have experienced. The need to keep people suffering so that they keep perpetuating misery and keep producing this L for the members of these Cabal overlords to basically eat up, right? And one more thing in addition, the addictive pleasures of this Losh is that all members of the Cabal are also fundamentally driven by the energy of the Arahim. If you remember what the Arahim was back from episode 1 and 2, they are the ones that dwell on the side of the void, who were let out from the Anunnaki when they tore the hole, the Azuris and the Arahim, right? Which they perpetuate all service to self-consciousness at its core. And the level of Arahim urge, their urge is to destroy all of creation. That's who they are, right? Really, really crazy stuff here. So we know that, I didn't hit these things because I didn't want to get into this too much, but we are in direct opposition to these people. That's who we are. And I stand in that. And that's when I say the forever students will never be silenced because we won't be. We fight against this at every angle. We uphold creation. We love creation. We invest in creation because it's service to others. We will never be of that service to self mindset. And hearing and reading about all this stuff makes me incredibly, incredibly mad that this went on behind the scenes for so long. Now, while there were people fighting against it, their foothold and grasp was just too much. But that's not what's happening today. We've turned the tide on this. Of we're of the side of taking everything back. And there's nothing they can do to stop it. Right? So, you know, it's really, really crazy. It's really crazy. And it's just I don't like seeing these things. And again, we didn't lend our energy to it, but knowing what was happening and what these entities were doing and still doing truly, truly is our work is cut out for us. And we have to keep going in this progression and keep projecting that positive. But keep going real quick because I don't want to go into rants. But so from the period following the destruction of Atlantis and Mu up to the early Dark Ages, there were occasional open conflicts going on between various groups of genetic farmer races, which often took place in the skies above the earth. Many of these battles are recounted and depicted in the stories and the artwork of the ancient Vedic texts, which is where modern day India would be, right? Which refers to the flying craft as Vimanas. And we talked about that a little bit before. Eventually, it was decided that these overt displays of technology were interfering with sociological development of the population. And so, shortly after this time of Muhammad, a treaty was signed and given the name by the Muhammad Accords. And we're going to go into what these Muhammad Accords are. This agreement stated that the manipulation of the human race and conflict between ET groups could hereafter only take place behind the scenes. The unfortunate outcome of this was that the Cabal only grew stronger, for behind the scenes manipulation was their specialty, right? So we get to the Dark Ages, right? The Dark Ages, the period of time after the fall of the Roman Empire and up to the Renaissance, was a time during which the Cabal spread and infiltrated many societies and institutions across the globe. Not much was going on other than suffering and power struggles, which only strengthened the Cabal's grip on land, right? There were some beacons of light, though, and this is what we have to talk about during this time. The beacons of light, which were kept glowing by small groups operating mostly in secret, the true followers of Buddha, Christ, and Muhammad, as well as a few secret societies who passed on enlightened teachings and history of the golden age of Atlantis and Mu from generation to generation. So that's important. That's who we are. We are a part of those societies, not secret anymore, but we're a part of those societies who protect the light and protect the information of the light, right? That's who we are. And we will keep manifesting that reality because it's instilled in us to be the adversary to the dark cabal satanic people. We cannot align with them. We'll never align with them, right? Let's keep going. So, you know, now we small areas where essentially the the light shines through, right? But like I said, it was dark, and the present, continuing this to the present day in general, the overall trend of this time, even though the Renaissance continuing to this present day, has been one of domination, colonialism, manifest destiny, increased disconnection from earth and nature, and increased trends towards the industrial might and warfare, all orchestrated by the Cabal, which is still infiltrating throughout all levels of culture, although they're not going to be doing that for much longer. And we'll get to that later on down the line. But There were better times when reason and love burned more brightly, like the Persian Empire, which was ended by the Arab conquest of Persia. This, in turn, brought about the Golden Age of Islam, which was ended by the Mongol horde, or the Renaissance, which was uh, subsumed by climate shifts and the Black Plague and warfare, all of which the Cabal had a hand in perpetrating. So basically, the Dark Ages really never ended. But you see, every time something bright would come forward, the Cabal was there to stamp it out. So there were trends and cycles, which is what we're doing now. But this is different from those because we win, right? Plain and simple, we win. They can't. We know who they are. So debt based economy rules, the oppression of indentured servitude, slavery, the rule of kings has simply been replaced by the 9 to 5 work week and pretend governments that function only as a smokescreen, right? The yoke and plow is essentially replaced by the smartphone and the remote control. We have progressed, our level of technology and the ability to create creature comforts greatly, yet our basic enslavement and oppression are the same. We are just more comfy and therefore more complacent. Make no mistake, we have, for well over 2,000 years, have been living in a planet that is essentially built to keep us down by the cabal. But the energy grids of Earth show us that this is not a slave planet. This is a hospital planet. This is a planet where our energies become restored when we become aware of our potential, right? So while there is all this darkness out there and people want to say this is a slave planet, it's not. This is a place to work out your traumas. This is a place to enhance your energies and move and light people up in the sense of your energy connects with theirs and they leave stronger as we move through this reality, right? This timeline prime. So, and I say that because it's important, right? It's important. This is essentially where we do our work and will never be tasked with being oppressed ever again. And we're there. We're there right now. So, you know, the cabal systems of control extend throughout society, particularly in the way of mainstream media and entertainment propaganda. They program our consciousness. The greatest tools the cabal has to oppress us is also the thing that we can use to set us free, for they know the reality fundamentally emanates from consciousness, and that by programming it the way that they do or the way that they want, they can perpetuate the reality that they want. And in order to break out of this, we have to learn to harness our power of consciousness and focus it into the reality that we want. We have to focus the consciousness to create the reality that we want, not what they want, right? And I know it's getting kind of like I'm, doing a sermon here, but this is this is what it's all about. This is what it's all about right here. So, this is tricky. This is tricky because all of the trauma we have experienced, both collectively and as individuals, right? Individually. This unresolved trauma keeps us in survival mode. It makes it very difficult to even access the parts of our brain and nervous system that facilitate the powerful intentional consciousness, right? And now, this is where we are right now. But at the end of all of this, right? At the end of all of these shows, I'm going to get to the solutions to all that. We're going to talk about solutions and healing those traumas, doing that dark work where people call it, you got to work out the dark and you got to be emboldened by it. You got to go through it. So we're going to talk about those things. I'm not just going to say these things and leave people hanging. We're going to go into more of the solutions. I don't have time on this episode to do that. But the next episode, we're going to go into the reemergence of extraterrestrial technology and the vril. We're going to get more into modern times, and I think that this is going to be an eye opener on why, certain entities came to power, especially in Europe. And I know some of this sounded like I was getting a little bit mad. I was reading that again. I wasn't sure if I should put that in there because I didn't want to talk about it in the sense of I didn't want to bring it forward. But then I thought my emotions can't get in the way of the information. So I did it and I said it. And some of it I left out because it was very graphic. But at the same time, we all know the story. And now we see how far back that story is truly being played out. And I want to make sure that we see that and it stays in the forefront, because if it stays in the forefront, we wake up every day asking what we can do to change that, right? That shadow work is something that we have to take care of. And it comes in time. It ends up becoming the freedom to set your consciousness to jolt to a higher vibration or a higher level of intellectual thinking. There's so much that we can go into that could be side stories of what we just went over. But these are the most important pieces, because when we get down to the line of today, you know, we're going to see things that are just going to blow your mind, right? It's all going to be really wild. But tonight, after this broadcast, go directly over to Watchers Talk. We're going to put the link in the chat so you can jump right over. You're going to go over there. You're going to like, share, and subscribe, because we support each other. We are a community. This is the FSF, right? It can stand for two things: the Forever Student Family or the Full Spectrum Family. We are one. We are a community. And if people don't like the sound of that, this isn't a cult. This is us enlightening each other, helping each other, supporting each other. This is what we need to do, and this is how we win, right? We're already winning. We just need to keep going and keep lifting up those around us. So, with that being said, my name's Rob Yox. This has been Full Spectrum Universe. Share this episode out. This is one of the most important episodes that we've done. Okay? Just because of the information we spoke about that I really didn't want to speak about. But it's important people understand it. It's important we change the hearts and minds of people out there to wake them up. They live in a state of hypnotism, right? We have to get them, we have to shake them awake somehow. The information will do that. So with that being said, I hope everybody has a great rest of the weekend. I love all of you. Spread the love each day. Wake up asking what you can do for others, and give them a hand. It's tough out there. We got to help each other. So, with that being said, my name is Rob Yox, and I hope y'all have a great rest of the night.